So now we're going to continue our topic of microbiology, going into chapter 18 with food safety. This chapter does have food safety that is both microbiological and non-microbiological, so we'll go over both. The majority of the chapter, though, is microbiology. So let's get into it. So what is food contamination? Is really just what we're focusing on. And food contamination is the state of being impure or unfit to use due to the introduction of either unwholesome or undesirable elements. So if it's unwholesome, that means it's not fit to eat. Undesirable means you just don't want it in the food. And so kind of a summary of that whole definition is when something not normally found in food is added, is contamination. There are 3 forms of contamination, and I think I might have changed the wording on these a little bit, and I want you to know it by the wording that I use, because that's going to fit nicely into the second part of the chapter when we talk about HACCP, and I actually have you do some hazard analysis for your food product development projects, okay? So the three types of contamination, or the 3 types of hazards that we find in food, are physical, chemical, and biological. I will briefly, a little bit less briefly, overview physical and chemical. Physical we'll go through pretty quickly. And then we'll get into the biological, and that's where we're focusing more on the microbiology. So physical contaminants, they may not change or damage the food itself, right? So it may be something like, gosh, let's see, like a bone is still in the food and it wasn't supposed to be. Or you got a bit of plastic in the food, but it's easily picked out, and the food itself is actually fine. Okay? So it may not actually be harmful, but it may or may not be a health hazard, right? Hair in food is, especially like if it's hair got in the food and then it was cooked, well, it's not actually a health hazard. It's been cooked. It's not going to harm you, but there's an ick factor, right? And you don't want it in the food. It is still a physical contaminant. So examples of physical contaminants or physical hazards are could be things like metal filings that can get into food through the machinery of a food processing facility. There's constantly gears moving and food being carried on belts and things like that. And if maintenance isn't being done properly, or maintenance misses something, you can sometimes get metal in the food. That actually happened once while I was at Smithfield, the hot dog plant that was adjacent to my office. I think it was the forms for their packaging machine somehow was getting worn away, and they ended up with little metal shavings in their Nathan's hot dogs, and a recall actually happened because of that. Plastic can get into food. That could be for the same reasons as metal filings. Most of those belts that the food is carried on in a food manufacturing facility, the belts are plastic, and so if something chips off or wears away, that can get into the food. It could be the like packaging material. Some of it gets chopped up and in the food. A lot of times when I'm thinking like from a meat industry perspective, we would have large cardboard bins of meat, because it has to be transported in some way from the place where the meat was produced, where the animals are slaughtered, to the processing facility, because the same place that slaughters the pigs is not the same place that makes the hot dogs. And so you have these big combos, is what we call them, of cardboard, and there'd be like 2 tons of meat in it. And obviously you don't want the meat directly in the cardboard, so you'd have it in a very large plastic bag. And so when you dump that meat, typically the plastic bag stays in the cardboard, but every once in a while there'd be some kind of tear or something like that. And these bags were blue so that the workers could easily pick it out amongst the red meat. But every once in a while, you know, get something that got missed, and there might potentially be plastic in the food product, and hopefully you catch that before it leaves the facility. Now, so plastic, it may or may not actually pose a health risk. You know, if you have small bits of that little blue, you know, very thin plastic, for example, it's not going to hurt anybody, but it is nonetheless contaminated and will result in recalls. Foreign material is the #1 recall reason, at least in USDA, probably in FDA too, in the United States. It's not pathogens, it is foreign material. So glass, that obviously is could be a major health hazard. Insects or insect eggs would be considered foreign material. Now, insects are allowed at certain levels in agricultural products because things are grown outside, right? So inspectors will examine these foods for insect parts. They're trained to recognize what are insect parts versus other bits of the food, because it might be harder for an untrained person to recognize that in you know, spices and things that like naturally have stems, right? They're also trained to identify the insect type from the parts, so they know what is contaminating the food. Insect eggs in some foods might be a big problem, but in other foods are not, and would be acceptable at certain levels. And it also just kind of depends on what the species of the eggs are. So trying to keep all the insects off of foods that are grown outside in the dirt would be impossible, even with conventional farming methods that employ pesticides. So even if you're getting, you know, non-organic, it's impossible to completely keep all insects out of plant matter. But if it is above a certain level, or there are certain insects that are more hazardous, then we do want to keep those out of the food. Rodent droppings would also be a physical contaminant. Rodent droppings are kind of both a physical and a biological contaminant, because they certainly can introduce biological dangers too. So FDA and USDA inspectors for physical contaminants, they're constantly examining food. The workers are too, for any kind of physical contaminants. There are also rules in food processing plants, like don't wear jewelry, because we don't want to get jewelry in the food. So chemical contaminants, these include things like pesticides. And so under the broad umbrella of pesticides, that includes insecticides, which are used to control insects on crops, herbicides, which control weeds that could affect crops, and these residues are tested to determine whether they pose a health hazard. So there are insecticides and herbicides that are approved for use in food products because they are not a health hazard, but there's also acceptable levels at which they might become a health hazard if they are above those levels. And so all of that is controlled. Antibiotics, hormones, and steroids. So in livestock, for all of these, there are withdrawal periods used before the animals are slaughtered. So you are not allowed to apply an antibiotic to an animal within X days of it being slaughtered for food, because that antibiotic needs to leave the system. The same goes for hormone and steroid treatments for the animals. Allergens are considered a chemical contaminant because it is a chemical reaction in the body that causes the issue. So our big 9 allergens are fish, shellfish, wheat, soy, dairy, eggs, tree nuts, peanuts, and sesame. And with those, the key thing is that there is a certain protein in those foods that the body of people who are allergic reacts to, and that is the allergic reaction. Toxins from mold. This is another one that is kind of both. If it's just the toxin itself, this typically falls under chemical contaminants, even though it's a biological thing that made it. But I would be okay with classifying it as a biological contaminant also. All right. Other chemical contaminants, processing and production contaminants. So these are things like the cleaning chemicals used to clean the machinery, refrigerants. So what is cooling down the room, if that leaks into the food, that can be a problem. Lubricants. All of this machinery has gears and things, and it needs lubrication, but some of that is not great to go in food. And so usually it's housed separately and it's not supposed to leak out, but accidents happen, and in that case it's a contaminant, and you would throw that food away. Acrylamide is a byproduct of frying and can be considered a contaminant. Packaging contaminants, so BPA, that's one that it's really been phased out quite a bit in the US. That cans aren't using BPA anymore. Phthalates would also be a packaging contaminant. Heavy metals, so these are metals such as lead, cadmium, mercury, and arsenic. All of these are unsafe for human consumption. And then additives used in excess. And so we've talked about that before, how there is a certain safe level of each additive, a known safe level. And if you have that additive above what is safe, now it is a chemical contaminant. Contamination can also happen from the water supply, and this can come in the form of pesticides. So pesticides specifically that are non-biodegradable have been banned, and so this is less of a concern than it used to be. Another source of contamination is industrial waste. Now, typically, when I've always heard the term industrial waste, this is what I'm thinking of. These pipes that are, letting water out that is filled with chemicals, right? But that is not necessarily what industrial waste, not even necessarily the main source of industrial waste. So, for example, if exhausts from whatever industry are emitted into the air, then they're going to be brought back down to the earth by rain. And so whatever chemicals are in the exhaust that is going up into the air, it's going to be brought down back to the surface. And from that point, it is in the water supply. It's in the rivers, in the lakes, in the oceans. And so this is actually part of how mercury gets into fish. Mercury is carried through the exhaust. It comes down as rain. Bacteria convert the mercury to methylmercury, which is actually more dangerous to our bodies. Then small zooplankton will consume the mercury. And so these are like small fish. Or very small sea life, I should say, not fish. And then small fish eat the zooplankton. Big fish eat the small fish. Even bigger fish eat the big fish. And these bigger fish also have long lifespans. So they are accumulating all of this mercury, because mercury basically stays in the body. It does not leave over years and years. So this is why pregnant women and young children are advised to avoid big top of the food chain fish such as swordfish, king mackerel, shark, and bluefin tuna, which are the biggest ones. But because they're going to have the highest level of mercury in their bodies because they live a long time and they're eating lots of little fish who are, yeah. So also it could be dumped directly into bodies of water like this. It also could be that pollutants are buried, and then the pollutant gets into the groundwater, and that is how it gets introduced to the water supply. So lead. Talked a little bit about mercury. Let's talk about lead. So here's some of the history of lead. In 1976, the average U.S. lead level was 12.8 microliters per deciliter. And lead in our blood at pretty much any level is not good. Okay. In 2018, the level had been reduced down to 0.8 microliters per deciliter, so much more acceptable. And so how was lead getting into people's body, and what's changed since then? Okay, so 1974, there was a Safe Drinking Water Act, which was one of the first times that lead level in drinking water started to be regulated. One of the biggest things was in 1975, unleaded gasoline was introduced. So leaded gasoline was the original form of gasoline. And what would happen is it would release lead in the exhaust, which could then settle on crops and in the water supply. And so that is how lead was getting into the water supply. 1978, there was regulation that no lead-based paint could be used for houses. The reason lead was in paint, it made colors brighter, it enhanced the durability of paint, it helped the paint resist moisture, it also sped up the drying during the painting process. All great things except lead. But the biggest thing that really probably affected this drop in lead levels was this here. So cans, they weren't made of lead, so food cans weren't made of lead, but the solder that applied and made the top of the can stick to the circumference of the pan, or of the can, the outer part of the can, main part, and so the bottom and the main part came together was solder, and that was originally made of lead. And so there's constantly lead leaching into foods from canned foods. So 1986, there was a ban on lead content plumbing materials. So again, removing sources of lead from the water supply. In 1991, there was a lead and copper rule. So this further reduced the lead that was allowed in drinking water. 1995, it took this long until finally there was a total ban on cans that had lead solder. So it started phasing it out in 1979, 1995, total ban. What probably happened here is high acid foods were phased out first because acidity and the lead interacting would cause more of it to leach out. But by 1995, it was completely banned. And then in 1995, finally, leaded gasoline was no longer available. So unleaded gasoline introduced in 1975, and 20 years later, leaded gasoline was no longer available at all. And in 2000, there was a further revision of the lead and copper rule, which reduced lead even further in the water supply. There's more to this, including some things that happened in the late 2000s, but this is the biggest stuff that had an impact on lead getting into people's bodies. So how can lead leach into your food now? Okay, because this is what's important to you now. Antique or homemade glazed ceramic dishes. So lead glazes are shinier with less surface tension. So when you're putting the glaze on, you get a smoother glaze because it just naturally just comes down instead of more of like a slow drip. And also, once it has been finished, it has less tendency to craze. So if you ever looked at something ceramic and it has like tiny, tiny, tiny cracks all over it, and it's just on the surface, that's called crazing. And leaded glaze doesn't do that as much. So it's more attractive to use, but can also be a problem and if you're using this on dishes that you eat food from. So avoid eating food from antique or homemade glazed ceramic dishes unless you know that that homemade glazed dish does not have any lead in it. Also, antique leaded crystal glassware and decanters. So such as this one. So leaded crystal or leaded glass was desirable for its clarity, and it also, having the lead oxide in there made the molten glass easier to work with and form. So this lead oxide was added about 18 to 40%. And so, yeah, modern crystal has barium oxide, zinc oxide, or potassium oxide, but lead crystal is still made today, and it would be labeled and sold as such if you bought it. Fun factoid, so the ring that comes when some glassware is tapped, instead of a, like you hear more of a ding, that only happens in leaded glassware, and it's because of the lead. So regular glasses are not, they're going to clink but not ring, but leaded glassware has a ring to it if you tap them. So don't consume food out of antique glassware and decanters is the takeaway there. And then silver-plated bowls, cups, etc. A lot of that antique silver-plated stuff, the base metal is lead, and then it was coated with silver. So if there's any nicks, scratches in it, and especially if you add something acidic to it, you risk lead leaching out and getting into you. So don't consume, like I said, don't consume particularly low pH foods from any of the above. So wine, low pH food, don't drink it from a leaded glass, for example. Not that any of you are drinking wine yet, but when you're older. Or don't drink your orange juice from a leaded glass container. Also, know that if you are doing any of these, adding heat in addition to a low pH is especially bad. So like this silver-plated bowl, you would not want to put spaghetti sauce in it and hot spaghetti sauce in it, okay, for example. Okay. Other chemical contaminants, so polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE coating. This is also known as Teflon. It's a nonstick coating on pans. This coating has been found to release perfluorooctanic acids, PFOAs, when heated to high temperatures, or it was found, I should say. And there's a link between these PFOAs and liver, hormone, immune, and thyroid problems, but these particular chemicals are no longer in Teflon products as of 12 years ago. However, there are still some chemicals that are in Teflon pans that people do have some concerns about. These are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAs, and they're also known as forever chemicals. They don't biodegrade, and they do stick around in your body. Now, they are released at temperatures at over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty high, okay? You're not usually cooking at these temperatures, okay? Certain PFAs can cause health risks even at very low levels. So not all of them cause major health risk, but some of them do. And it has been found that some of these PFAs are in drinking water, food packaging, and fish from contaminated waters. So the food packaging, this could be any like fast food papers that cover your burgers that are grease resistant. Well, it's non-stick, right? And so it's a similar chemical that they are coating that with. Microwave popcorn bags, the same thing. The inside of that is keeping the grease from coming out. That's a chemical coating. Pizza boxes, candy wrappers, anything non-stick typically has these. Wax paper would not be that, right? Wax paper is totally different. So the health risks of PFAs, this isn't fully researched yet, but it could possibly include some increased risk of cancers, increased cholesterol levels and risk of obesity, suppressed immune system, developmental effects in babies and children, and potentially decreased fertility. So Teflon pans nonstick pans are not the best thing in the world. So some tips to reduce exposure from Teflon pans if you are still using them. Don't preheat empty pans. You don't want them to get to that 500 degrees Fahrenheit level, which is more likely if you're just heating a pan by itself. Avoid cooking on high heat. Ventilate your kitchen because what happens is a lot of these chemicals, they become airborne when you're cooking. So ventilate your kitchen, just get it out of your kitchen as soon as it comes up. Use wooden, silicone, or plastic utensils so you don't get pans like this, right? No scratching your pans. When you're washing them, hand wash them. Don't use a dishwasher, and use a sponge that's not abrasive so you aren't scratching the pan. And replace old cookware. Anything that looks like this should not be used anymore. Alternatives to Teflon, because that's important if I'm telling you Teflon is not great. Stainless steel pans, cast iron pans, stoneware, ceramic cookware, and silicone cookware is not great for like cooking on top of a stove, but for baking, silicone cookware is a good alternative. Okay, so now we're going to get into biological contaminants. So now we're getting into the microbiology. And so biological contaminants are going to include bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites. So first, let's talk about spoilage versus pathogenic organisms, because this is an important distinction. And mostly in this chapter, we're talking about pathogens, but spoilage is a contaminant too. But what is the difference? Spoilage microorganisms, their growth and their effects can be seen, tasted, or smelled, right? This is when you open up something and, oh, it smells gross. Or you have an old package of hot dogs and you lift one out and there is slime extending from one hot dog to another because they've been in your refrigerator too long. Or this is this right here that you see growth, okay? Now, typically, almost always, even though there's a yuck factor, something that is spoiled like this is not going to cause illness. Now, assuming it has been properly stored, okay? Like it's been in your refrigerator, it's been kept under clean conditions, etc. Okay? And why that is we've talked about this a little bit before, but whatever bacteria, fungi, whatever can grow the best is going to take over. And if for spoilage organisms, there's usually a really high level of microorganisms before spoilage is evident. And so they have taken over that product and prevented anything else from growing. Okay. So just because something smells bad doesn't mean it's not safe. I'd still throw it out because it's still kind of gross, but you're not, you, in a typical situation, you're not going to get hurt from that as long as that food was actually stored properly. Okay. Now, pathogens, on the other hand, things that do make you sick, they usually cannot be seen, tasted, or smelled. So, part of me telling you that this isn't going to make you sick is to make you realize that this will. Okay. So smelling something, oh, it smells okay, is not a good indication of whether something has pathogens in it and can make you sick. Oh, this tastes okay. That's not going to give you an indication of whether it could make you sick, because pathogens usually cannot be seen, tasted, or smelled. And unlike the spoilage organisms, where there's a high level of them before the spoilage is evident, typically the pathogens are in pretty small amounts and can still make you sick. There's not usually an indicator. There's one or two exceptions, but there's not usually an indicator that those pathogens are even there, and that's because they're in very small quantities and can still make you sick. Okay, so now let's focus on the pathogen part. We're going to get away from spoilage and not really talk about spoilage organisms now. Foodborne illness. So the CDC estimates that 48 million people get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die from foodborne illnesses every year in the U.S. This number is updated from the current CDC website and is lower than the book. In general, even though these numbers seem high, the U.S. has a very safe food supply compared to most other countries. Okay, we are pretty on top of it. So an outbreak is when 2 or more people are known to become ill from eating the same food. Okay, so as long as 2 people get sick, it's called an outbreak. And then we're going to divide foodborne illnesses into 2 types of illness. One is a foodborne intoxication, and this is when a toxin released by the microbes is what makes you sick. That toxin might be released before you even consume the food, or it might be released in your body. But it's the toxin itself that makes you sick. A foodborne infection is caused by the microbes themselves and the digestive enzymes that they are using to eat their food that actually end up damaging the body tissue in your body. Okay, so foodborne intoxication first. So because it's the toxin that makes you sick, the key thing to know about foodborne intoxication is that even if that microorganism is killed, if you haven't gotten rid of that toxin, you will still get sick. And some of these toxins that we'll go through are not damaged by heat, so cooking doesn't help. Our major bacteria that cause foodborne intoxication are Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum, Staphylococcus aureus, and Escherichia coli. And that's just certain strains of those. Not all of them make you sick on that one. So now we're going to go through each one of these. Clostridium perfringens. It is one of the most common foodborne illnesses in the United States. Actually, about 1 million people get Clostridium perfringens poisoning each year. Okay. The symptoms of this are stomach cramps and watery diarrhea for 1 to 2 days. It's usually not very serious. That's why you probably never heard of Clostridium perfringens, because it doesn't really typically cause major illness or death. Incubation time for this before you actually start to feel sick is 6 to 24 hours after eating the contaminated food. Clostridium perfringens is prevalent in the environment as spores. So remember that spores are dormant bacteria. They have a coating during this dormancy that protects them. And then once they are introduced to conditions that are just right for them to grow, they come out of the spore form. Unfortunately for us, hold on a second. So those spores can, let me back up a little bit. Those spores are heat resistant. They can survive cooking. And then if we don't keep the food at a temperature that they don't like, then they can grow. And then when we consume them, that is when we get sick. Okay. Clostridium perfringens, they are facultative anaerobe. They prefer no oxygen, but they also grow with oxygen present. And it does take a large number of bacteria to cause illness. So we have to give them just the right conditions for them to grow and become a large number before they cause illness. These bacteria, so how they cause illness is you consume a large number, then once they get to your intestines, they're going to produce the enterotoxin, and that is what will make us sick. So how do we control Clostridium perfringens? One is limit contamination, proper sanitation. The C. perfringens is all over the environment, but the less that you are touching other things and then touching your food, the less chance that it's going to get on your food. Preventing growth. So how do we prevent that growth? We keep the food at a temperature at which the C. perfringens is not happy. So keep our hot foods hot and our cold foods cold. Clostridium perfringens grows best between 56 and 123 degrees Fahrenheit. This is different from what the book says, quite different from what the book says. And so this is within what we consider the danger zone within food. I don't know if you've ever heard it before, but you should know it for this chapter, for the exam. The danger zone for food is between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So between those temperatures is where most pathogenic bacteria are going to grow, somewhere in between there. So if we keep it below 40 and we keep it above 140, we're generally safe. So what does that mean? Hot food, cool it quickly, right? Potlucks are the perfect environment for Clostridium perfringens. You have catered events, cafeterias are also common places where outbreaks start. Thanksgiving and Christmas is the most common time of the year for C. perfringens outbreaks. All of that turkey or roast beef that is just sitting out for hours. And so there were spores in there, and the temperature dropped to a temperature where the Clostridium was happy and the spores come out of dormancy and then grow to a level that can make people sick. Okay. So if they're not spores, they're easily killed by heat, but in the spore form, they are not. So, like I said, cooking easily kills active cells, but those spores will remain. So always assume they are there, and because C. perfringens is prevalent in the environment, and cool your food down quickly. Clostridium botulinum. So a significantly lower number of people are affected by this each year. Only about 200 people get botulism each year. And this one is caused by ingesting the toxin in general. There is an exception, which we'll go over. So that you consume the toxin. So the bacteria have already grown and produced a toxin in the food source. You consume the toxin, that enters the bloodstream. The toxin travels to your nerve cells, and it prevents nerve impulses from being transmitted. This causes what's called flaccid paralysis, so you're just limp, okay? It can be deadly because if your lungs are paralyzed, you can't breathe. And your diaphragm is a muscle, and so if that's paralyzed, you can't use it and you can't breathe. The symptoms of botulism are typically between 12 and 24 hours after eating the contaminated food. Clostridium botulinum is also prevalent in the environment and also forms spores. But unlike the Clostridium perfringens, these are obligate anaerobes, which means they can only survive in an oxygen-free environment. They do need a pH that is higher than 4.6. And like I said, usually the illness comes from directly ingesting the toxin. So we'll talk about the situations in which you're susceptible to this in a minute. But first we'll talk about the exception to this rule, that you get sick from ingesting the toxin. So infant botulism, which is actually 70% of the roughly 200 cases per year, is usually infant botulism. And this is because infants don't have a fully developed gut, and bacteria can grow in their gut. So in adults, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria cannot grow in our guts. Remember, they don't like pH less than 4.6. Our stomach pH is way less than 4.6. But in infants, their gut is not fully developed, and the bacteria can survive. Especially that spore can get past the stomach and into the intestines and start growing. So how infants get this, the biggest source is honey. It is just very common that there are Clostridium botulinum spores in honey. So never give honey to children that are under 1 year of age. They can also potentially get it by playing in contaminated dirt. So I'm not a big clean freak with my kids, but maybe limit the playing in the dirt a little bit, because you do run a risk of this and it's pretty serious. So most non-infant cases come from improperly processed home canned food. So like I said before, it grows best in a pH that is greater than 4.6 that has no oxygen. And so canned foods that are made with low acid foods, so like tomatoes would be a high acid food, jams and jellies are a high acid food, but things like green beans or meats, things like that, these are low acid foods, and these are a perfect environment for Clostridium botulinum because there's no oxygen and the pH is greater than 4.6. Spores survive boiling easily, and so that is how it gets in the canned food. Very prevalent in the environment. The spores survive the boiling, and then after you've canned it, now there's no oxygen, it's a great pH, the cells come out of dormancy because they're in a perfect environment, and they start producing the toxin. They are destroyed at temperatures of 250 degrees Fahrenheit or better or higher. So this requires a pressure cooker. In the food industry, that's basically what they're doing. They have special canning facilities that are high pressure and achieve this temperature. Okay, so if you're canning low acid foods at home, you need to use a pressure cooker. Now, it is not recommended to can in an Instant Pot, which is the most common pressure cooker these days, because you actually have no idea what pressure it actually is, and so you can't calculate what the temperature actually is in the cans. So do not use an Instant Pot. Use old-fashioned pressure cooker that has a readout of what the actual pressure is. So the spores are destroyed at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The toxin, not the spores, but the toxin is destroyed with at least 5 minutes at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you were to can your foods and didn't use this very highly recommended method of canning it, but even if you did, just in case, you should always boil or simmer your home canned low acid foods before you eat them, just to be safe. In processed meats, sodium nitrite does control the growth, and we've talked about that before, and it also controls the growth of Clostridium perfringens. Okay, next one is Staphylococcus aureus. The name of this one tells you quite a bit about it. Staphylococcus. So coccus means they're cocci, so they're spherical. The first part, the staphyle, comes from the Greek word staphyle, which means bunch of grapes. And aureus comes from the Latin word for golden. So it's a golden bunch of grapes, and this is what they look like when they are magnified. They literally look like clusters of golden grapes. There are about 241,000 cases per year, so not as common as Clostridium perfringens, but way more common than botulism. When you get this, you know it. There is sudden nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal cramps. A term that could be used for this is a double bucket disease, because both the vomiting and diarrhea are occurring at the same time potentially, and are often referred to as explosive. So it is a very uncomfortable one. You get these symptoms within 30 minutes to 8 hours after consumption, so you might get it pretty immediately, or it could take a little bit. And the good news is that it lasts 24 hours or less, so it's not long-lasting. It's not typically one that anybody gets hospitalized for. It's just very unpleasant. Staphylococcus aureus is a facultative anaerobe, so it can do both oxygen or no oxygen, and it is not a spore former, unlike the Clostridia. What makes it somewhat more prevalent in some foods is that it will grow in high salt, so it is a concern for processed meats. The growth occurs from 44 degrees Fahrenheit to 118 degrees Fahrenheit, so within that danger zone of 40 to 140. And if it is in this growth range, it will produce a toxin that is extremely heat stable. You're not getting rid of it. Unlike the Clostridium botulinum, where you can cook it and save yourself from the toxin, you can't reheat your food contaminated with Staph aureus and get away from it. So how we control it? Well, it's caused by touching food and then holding it at danger zone temperatures. It's not a spore former. So if you have heated that food, like if there was staph on the food and you cooked it before it grew, right? So if you had it at good temperatures, preventing growth, you cook it, the staph is dead, it's gone. And then somebody else touches it after it has been cooked. And then it is held at danger zone temperatures. This should say 40 to 140. It says 4. Should it say 40 to 140? It's 4 degrees Celsius, but that would be two different temperature measures. Okay. Uh, so most often it's been touched after it was cooked and then not properly cooled after cooking. The humans are the main source. Staph aureus lives on the skin. You've probably heard of a staph infection before, right? And that is an infection of your skin. And it's the exact same organism. Sometimes staph causes an infection on your skin and sometimes it doesn't. So you have to have like an actual cut and then certain strain of Staph aureus, particularly that is resistant to antibiotics, and that causes infection issues. But staph live happily on your skin, on everyone's skin. Particularly, they like moist spots, like in your nose. They are prevalent in acne, infected cuts. Anyone who has cold and flu symptoms is suggested that they not be the one handling food. And that's mostly because, well, one, sneezing, but also if you're touching your face a lot because you have a runny nose and staph are in the nose, then that is a potential agent for you to spread it to the food. So the biggest thing that you can do to prevent Staph aureus infection is if you're the one handling food, you are washing your hands frequently. You don't touch your face while working with food. And you clean and sanitize work surfaces that other people are touching, right? You also want to rapidly cool foods or serve them quickly. We want to get foods down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit within 4 hours, or growth will start to occur. And just remember that reheating will not destroy the toxin. So think about leftovers at a fast food or at a restaurant, and yeah, it's been cooked, but if you leave it in your car that is between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours before you can get home, if anybody has touched that food, you are running between the time it was cooked and the time that you put it into your car, then you are running the risk of Staph aureus poisoning. Okay, and now Escherichia coli. So there are hundreds of E. coli strains that exist. Most of them are harmless. There are 6 types, and within each type there are going to be several strains, but there are 6 types that are pathogenic. There is enteropathogenic E. coli, which is abbreviated EPEC. These result in watery or bloody diarrhea. There's enterotoxigenic E. coli, which causes what's called traveler's diarrhea, so it's often in water supplies. There's enteroinvasive E. coli, which causes dysentery and sometimes bloody diarrhea. There's enteroaggregative E. coli, which causes watery diarrhea that lasts more than 14 days. There's diffusely adherent E. coli, and this causes acute diarrhea and vomiting, or it might be asymptomatic, and so you have preschoolers spreading it to everyone around them. But the major one, all of these sound awful, but the most well-known and most dangerous E. coli is of the type called Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, or STEX. These cause bloody diarrhea, severe cramps, vomiting, and something called hemolytic uremic syndrome, which basically shuts down your kidneys. This is also known as enterohemorrhagic E. coli because the affecting blood part, there's actually hemorrhaging that goes on in your capillaries. So STEX, the strains of STEX can be deadly, particularly for small children, the elderly, and immunocompromised individuals. I believe I've talked about this before, way back at the beginning of the year. But there in 1993, there was a Jack in the Box outbreak. And in that, several children died, and many elderly were affected as well. And so this was caused by E. coli 0157H7, which is one of the many Aztecs. E. coli has a very low infective dose. The bacteria easily grow and release toxin in our guts. So there doesn't have to be much at all of contamination with these E. coli to cause severe illness. The onset of illness is between 18 hours and 14 days, though it's most often 3 to 4 days. Now, I'm not going to have you memorize any of these onset times, but what I do want you to get out of it is that almost all of these, with the exception of Staph aureus, we are talking 6 hours to several days before you experience any symptoms after you eat the contaminated food. And so the key point I want you to take home there is that whenever you get a foodborne illness, it is most likely not the last thing you ate. And it's really, really difficult to actually determine what it was that caused your illness unless you know all the other people in the outbreak and you can figure out what exactly it was that all of you ate at the same time. So that's just a key point that's more for personal knowledge than anything, is that when you get sick from food, it's usually not the last thing that you ate. So symptoms usually last 3 to 4 days with this, but in particularly severe cases, it can last up to 2 weeks. So how do we control E. coli? Well, E. coli comes from feces. So somehow feces have gotten into the food if you become sick from E. coli. Now, it could be from the water, could be from contaminated water, particularly in other countries, but also washing your hands after using the restroom in case you are the carrier of E. coli, preventing other people from getting sick. Making sure you cook ground meats thoroughly. Now, how does it get into ground meat? Well, ground meat comes from an animal, and in the process of slaughter, it is very difficult to not allow any of the exterior part of the animal touch the interior part of the animal. There's dust that might be in their fur that then is carried in the air. Now, measures are certainly taken to prevent that, but it's impossible to 100% prevent that. They do other things, like they do acid washes of carcasses, which if you were on the field trip with us, you saw that. But nothing is 100% foolproof with this. And so you're dealing with an animal. There are feces involved inside the animal, on the exterior of the animal, because poop gets on exterior of the animal, and somehow it gets on the exterior surface of the carcass. Well, especially with ground beef, you are cutting everything up and then mixing it. And so what was on the exterior is now on the interior of the meat. And so you have to make sure that the interior of this meat gets cooked to a temperature that will kill E. coli. And that temperature is 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, why you can eat steak and not get sick is because if there is any contamination on the steak, it's on the exterior of that steak, right? The E. coli cannot get into the interior of that steak. unless there's been something done to puncture it. So like a tenderized steak, you would want to cook all the way through. Like a tenderized steak that's been tenderized with knives or needles. But steak, you don't have to cook all the way through because the E. coli is not on the inside. Ground beef, you have effectively made the exterior the interior with that. Okay, so other than meat, don't cross-contaminate when you're cooking. If you have a plate of raw ground beef patties and you took it out to the grill, bring that plate inside and wash it, stick in the dishwasher, get a new clean plate before you come out and get the fully cooked burgers, right? You don't want to contaminate the food with raw juices. Wash your produce thoroughly. There is E. coli in the ground. It could be from contaminated water. It could be from animals that are outside. It could be from fertilizers if they're manure-based. So there's still a risk, even in produce. And in fact, just in general, a lot of outbreaks come from produce. You think that more of them are from meat, but a lot are from produce, from various different kinds of produce. Not just E. coli, but other bacteria also. I would avoid raw sprouts entirely unless you are absolutely sure that you have a supplier that has taken major measures to prevent E. coli in their raw sprouts. There's lots of outbreaks have happened with raw sprouts. The environment that raw sprouts are grown in is very warm and moist, and so it just grows E. coli quite well. And so I would not eat sprouts at all unless they have been cooked. Now, otherwise, like produce, leafy greens are probably the most susceptible produce to E. coli contamination, and it's I've said contaminated water. It could be the soil. It's also potentially just carried in the air through the wind, and can land on leafy greens, and then you consume those and get sick. So just wash your produce thoroughly before consuming, or make sure you've bought produce that's already been washed. So that is where we're going to stop today, and then next week we will cover the rest of the chapter, including the foodborne infections part of the chapter. So everything up to now has been foodborne intoxication with E. coli. The toxin is that shikatoxin. And yeah, so this is a lot of information in these last two chapters. I totally recognize that, but it's good stuff to know even as a consumer. So have a great week.